Right, so today I wanted to talk a little bit about this post I seen from Luke Rudowski saying someone said it's a man's world out there. So this looks like it was from the men's rights Reddit page saying differences of living as a woman versus a man in my experience. So they say, so I'm a transgender man, and there are a few things different about how I was treated when I identified as a woman compared to now as a man. So they have a list of points here, starting with when I'm expected to just deal. Sorry, when I'm expected to just deal with things. When I was a woman, I needed help. People would offer it to me before I even got the chance to ask. Now I'm supposed to just be fine and deal with all my problems. I get less sympathy now. I don't get much attention. I thought I wouldn't mind this because I don't like people noticing me, but it makes me feel lonely. I hardly get any compliments anymore. People are hesitant to believe me when I say things. People assume I'm a bad person now when I'm actually just minding my own business. Body shamed more as a man. I experience more harassment as a man. I'm a shy person, but when I was a woman, people thought I was cute and mysterious. Now they just think I'm a weirdo and a creep. I experience more sexism now. Uh, and the last one, I have worse mental health now, mostly to do with financial pressure and pressure to date, which I don't feel when I was a woman. Now, um, obviously, this is just one person's experience, but this is very interesting with the whole transgender thing that we have people that can literally see this for real, right? And not to mention, too, I mean, it's not like you need these people to know this stuff, but it is nice to see real world examples of this stuff, right? And this is something that I've pointed out a lot, right? A lot. And it's not that a lot of people dismiss this as people being like, pissed off and stuff like that, but it's not that, right? The reality behind this, I think, is the lies, right? The reality is the lies. And a lot of people nowadays, definitely the majority, they still act like the majority, or a lot of people, it's even the only forms of sexism that exist these days is um, women being the victims, right? But in reality, that's not the case. There's not one legitimate example of sexism where women get the short end of the stick that I'm aware of. Now, there's some ways that women get the short end of the stick, but it has nothing to do with sexism, right? In that, women get paid less, but that's simply the average income of women versus men. When you actually look, the reality of the gender pay gap is that it's entirely a married versus unmarried women and men thing. That if you look at unmarried women, they get paid the same. In fact, I've seen some studies that show that they actually get paid more. So the reality of the gender pay gap is it is simply women, typically women who are married or have kids, who simply choose to work lower paying jobs and or less hours. And why is that? Is that women are the traditional um, sex that raises kids. And again, that has nothing to do with sexism and everything to do with number one, men can't breastfeed, contrary to what the crazy social justice warrior idiots would have you think. And number two, again, biology just dictates that too, and that women have been the ones raising kids for tens of thousands of years. Like, it's very funny how the left constantly ridicules Christians about evolution, but they completely ignore the evolution of the sexes, right? Evolution, yeah, Christians, you guys are so stupid, you don't believe in evolution, but they completely ignore the evolution of the sexes in that women have been the ones raising kids for tens of thousands of years, and men are are arguably, I would argue, and I'm sure most people that actually know what they're talking about would argue, men are more important in raising kids once they get to be teenagers, or in that, maybe in that 11, 12, 13 range, simply because that is when they are becoming adults, and that is when it's important to have positive male influences. And there's ample amounts of data that shows that you know, not having a man in the, the biological father in the picture does a lot of harm to both women and men, especially men. It's in different ways in that for men, the data is very clear that if you grow up in a single mother household, you're not only more likely, but significantly more likely to end up in jail, significantly more likely to be addicted to drugs, to not only that, end up in the same situation that your parents were in. Basically, every negative life outcome, you are significantly more likely to end up in. And it's the same thing for women, right? It's the exact same thing for women. So that's something that's very important. And again, there's other lies too that have been told too, that the idea that women face this horrible sexism in the past, it's not true, or at the very least, it's grossly overstated. But either way you say it, it's either a complete lie or grossly overstated. I mean, we can just get into the examples. The first and most popular one is um, women didn't have the vote because of sexism. That's just a flat out lie. Women didn't have the vote because they weren't subject to the draft. There was a Supreme Court case. I forget if it was prior to World War One or during World War One, but a man challenged the idea that men were subject to the draft, and they said in the Supreme, this is the Supreme Court, right, the highest court of the land, said because you guys have the have the vote, you're subject to the draft, right? So again, nothing to do with sexism. It had absolutely and utterly nothing to do with sexism. So that's a big lie, and not to mention too, um, if you look at the feminists, none of them are saying we're fine if we're subject to the draft, we still want the right to vote. None of them ever say that. So they're confessing that they're completely unaware of history, and or um, they want all the perks, but they don't want any of the benefits, right? They want a free lunch, basically. So either way you cut it, they're wrong, right? And I mean, if you look at other things too, if you look at, oh well, women were forced to stay home and raise kids, well, that's the one that I don't think is a flat out lie. That one's just very, very misleading. Now, if you go back to the early 1900s, if you look at the starting in the early 1900s up until World War One, if you look at women as as a percentage of college graduates, as a percentage of people in the workforce, it was going up pretty consistently up until World War Two. After World War Two, well, there was the baby boom, and what happened? Well, women needed to stay home because if you have three, four, five kids, someone's got to look after them. You can't just dump them in daycare. I know that's what a lot of the people suggest nowadays, but and the other reason for that too is that back then you didn't need a second income. This is the other big lie of feminism, is part of the reason why women didn't work is because they didn't have to, right? Back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, um, women didn't need to work. You could get by very easily. You could have what is today a $80 to $100,000 a year income as a man with a high school degree rather easily, like arguably easier than even if you have a college degree nowadays. And not to mention too, life was more affordable too, right? You could like back in like the 50s, a median, you want what an average house, right? A middle class house was literally like 2 years income, right? You could like imagine a what is today like a $500,000 house costing 150 $200,000. That's how much more affordable things were back then, right? And not to mention that people could afford everything that could afford a middle class lifestyle without even needing any debt. Nowadays, unless you're absolutely killing it, like making $250,000 a year, you need debt to get by. You need credit cards. You need a mortgage. You need what most people need, a car loan, right? Unless you're driving a bare bones car, right? Maybe not necessarily a car loan. If you're smart with money, you don't need it necessarily. But most people, if you can get a good if you can get a car loan at like 1 or 2, 3%, in my opinion, it's worth it as long as you're getting the car for a good deal. But again, that's just my opinion. But so these are just some things of the past that people just aren't aware of, or they're just straight up lies. If you look nowadays, like I said, there's no forms of sexism that disproportionately hurt women nowadays that I'm aware of, right? The gender pay gap is completely made up. If you look at a lot of big corporations, they will ask you on the job application, are you a man or a woman or other, right? They'll ask you if you're a minority. They'll ask you if you're LGBT, right? And anyone with a brain knows that they're not asking you those questions because they only want to hire white, straight men. Everybody knows that they need a certain percentage of minorities, of women, of LGBT, right? Everybody knows that. So, like it or not, again, this is just the basic facts. The sexism that exists nowadays disproportionately hurts men, not women. The majority of racism these days disproportionately hurts whites, not any. And again, if you look at mixed race people, how many mixed race people do you know that overly identify with being white? Almost every mixed race person identifies with the race that isn't white. Why is that? Because it benefits them. So we really need to stop pretending otherwise as a society. And again, another thing people too is that they'll take me out of context and say, "Oh, you think we should promote racism or sex?" No, I'm simply saying let's start treating people as actually equal. The problem with the leftist social justice warrior types is they have this impossible standard, right? They think that if there was any differences between men and women, between blacks and whites, then that must mean that there's sexism. That must mean that there's racism. But that's absolutely and utterly crazy. That's like suggesting that if Connor McDavid is a better hockey player than the average beer leaguer, which is obviously like a million times better than the average beer leaguer, that must mean that there is prejudice and bias in hockey. No, like anyone with a brain knows there isn't. He's just insanely good and he practices a lot, right? So the reason why Jeff Bezos and people like that are so rich, they do some shady stuff. Yeah, I would acknowledge that, but the reason they make so much more money is they're just that smart. They're just that good at business. Just like Connor McDavid is just that good at hockey, right? And it's the same thing with men and women. The reason why there's differences is because women choose the differences. There's the vast majority of the difference is not sexism. Same goes for blacks versus whites, right? I mean, if you look at the male, like this is another way that you know that they're wrong about it too, is that if you look at the male female sentencing gap in for prison, it's significantly larger than the black white gap. But yet, how many people do you hear complaining about the male female gap? Even though it's way bigger than the black white gap, and the black white gap is almost exclusively due to blacks committing more crime, right? So at the end of the day, the people that complain about this stuff are either incredibly uneducated about the reality of these things, which is most people, or they have bad intentions, right? Most people, I think it's just they have absolutely no idea what's going on. They're very naive. They're the textbook examples of the Dunning-Kruger effect. All this kind of stuff. They believe the mainstream media propaganda. So getting back to the main point here, life is a lot harder for men these days. Let's just be honest about it. Again, a lot of people, like I say, they'll say, "Oh, this is only one person's point of view," but I think a lot of this stuff is very, very obvious, right? In that, I mean, when women hurt themselves, pretty much everybody bends over backwards to help them, right? You know, women, especially attractive women, constantly complain about, "Oh, there's always men staring at me and I'm always getting, always having guys hit on me and stuff like that." But you know that's the hazards of being a attractive woman, right? Not that I'm support, doing creepy things, but again, like they say here too, is that I'm a shy person, but when I was a woman, people thought I was cute and mysterious. Now they just think I'm a weirdo and a creep, right? That's the problem. Like I'm sure most guys that hit on attractive women, it's not that they have terrible intentions, right? It's just they have hormones, right? Let's be honest about it, right? Um, I mean, and this is another thing too, that society absolutely turns a blind eye to men's problems and absolutely amplifies women's problems. How do I know that, right? Well, men are, I think it's 3 to 4 times more likely to commit suicide. I don't know what the exact number is, but I know it's significantly more likely. If you flip those numbers around, they like the people would be talking about that 10 times as much as they talk about the gender pay gap. That would be the biggest issue of our time, right? Men are like 80-90% of homeless people, right? If that was in the other way around, we would have to completely stop society. We got to raise taxes. We got to do whatever it takes to get these homeless people not being homeless anymore, right? And the list just goes on, right? So this is the way we, and again, I'm not saying that we need to, and people always, they love to completely take you way out of context. You know, you think we should promote sexism. Like, no, I'm simply saying we need actual equality. And we need to talk about the actual forms of sexism that go on, not the fake make believe, like I say, gender pay gap, women didn't have the right to vote because of sexism, just complete lies, right? Let's start dealing with reality, right? And this is the thing about, anything basically, is that you can't deal with a problem in life until you understand the reality of the problem and until you actually know the entirety and what's causing it too. And this is the thing too, is that people just completely want to gloss over what's causing these problems, the reality of these problems, and just shoot from the hip, quick fix, boom. I don't want to deal with it, right? So um, I just think that this is a very interesting topic, and I think it really needs to be talked about more. So that's why I wanted to talk about it. So anyway, if you liked the video, make sure you hit that like and subscribe. Check out those links below. Give me a follow on those other platforms, so on and so forth. So like I say, check out those links and stay tuned for more.